So good morning, everyone. I'm just going to hang on a second because we have a lot of participants joining us. So do bear with us for a couple of seconds while we let those people in. So just to say a gentle opening welcome to everyone. There's still a lot of people joining. We were having amongst the participants an opening conversation about how many layers of thermal clothing you need to attend this webinar. So I do hope everyone is keeping warm in this pre-Christmas period. There are almost 1,000 people, I think, who signed up for this seminar. So please bear with us. There's still quite a few people joining. It might just take a couple of minutes. I promise you it won't take away from the core of the training session, which we'll preserve the right kind of time for. Just give it a couple more minutes before we begin. Okay, well, out of courtesy to all of you who've joined very promptly and on time, we'll make a gentle start. You're going to get some opening comments from me anyway, which are essentially designed to allow everybody else to join, and then we'll move on to our other two speakers. So a very warm welcome to this TCPA webinar on flood risk and coastal erosion. My name is Dr. Hugh Ellis, and I'm Director of Policy at the Town and Country Planning Association. And this is a session that we're running in collaboration with the Environment Agency and is supported by Floodery, and you'll hear from Anne in a little while. The basic framework for this session is that there'll be some opening comments from me and from Anne, and then the heart of this is about the really important new updated planning guidance, and Sam Kipling from the Environment Agency is going to take you through that, and there'll be some opportunities for questions later. So next slide, please. So we are recording this session, and that's because in the new year, a version of this will be made available. So if colleagues have missed it, you'll be able to download a recorded version. That will just be focused on Sam's presentation, so it won't include the Q&A session. So feel free and relaxed to ask whatever you like. There are no stupid questions about planning for flood risk. This session is designed for different levels of expertise in the audience, but please be aware that there are a range of resources for communities on the TCPA website, prepared with the Flood Forum, and there's also an opening video, which I think, Sam, you were telling us has been seen by lots of young people in the last couple of weeks as well. So that's available on our website, which is a basic introduction for planning for flood risk. Please submit your questions to the Q&A function, if that's okay. You can imagine with so many people on the call, it's very difficult to get through all of those, but we will do our very best and to follow them up. There is a survey running for local government, which I'll bring some attention to at the very end of this session. And there will also be frequently asked questions resource being provided in the new year as well. So hopefully a range of resources to follow up this training session. Next slide, please. The agenda is quick word from me, a quick word from Anne Chatterjee from the Floodery, who's very kindly supporting this work. And then, as I said, Sam Kipling, followed by the Q&A. It wraps up in an hour. You will be out of here in 1 hour. So it's quite a concentrated session. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to do some opening comments about climate change and flood risk, but I guess for all of you on this call, there's very little need to do that. I think we have some people on this call from my town where I'm sat in Matlock. Each of our communities is suffering badly from flood risk. The impact on our economy and on people is disastrous. Matlock itself has lost people to flooding very tragically over the last 3 years. And has to be our top priority for economic development and for the social resilience of our communities. Next slide, please. I don't need to tell you how difficult this has been. COP27 basically abandoned the 1.5-degree target as a realistic target, and that means we're entering into uncharted territory. When you want to look at the Environment Agency and government probabilities on things like sea level rise, you need to reflect on the fact that we're moving away from trying to get a kind of planetary stability on climate at 1.5 degrees, which means just simply much bigger impacts. Next slide, please. And those impacts are dramatic for our region in the East Midlands, dramatic impacts on coastline. Sam will take you through the complexity of flooding from all sources, which means that places that haven't been hit by surface water are now being hit hard. And obviously the social justice implications of that as well. The people in poorest incomes tend to be hit hardest in terms of insurance and resilience. Next slide, please. So just in relation to the planning system, I'm an enthusiastic planner, which I know is sometimes it's seen as a rare thing because the reputation of planning is not high at the moment. But planning is so important to giving communities a hopeful future. We have to get organised, and we have to use the planning system as a really powerful tool to shape places that cut emissions and are resilient to climate change. Inside planning law, there are 4 legal duties currently inside the planning system. The most powerful one is on climate change. Section 19, 2004 Act says all local plans must have policies to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So you have a very powerful hook to put this at the top priority of your agenda. And those communities that are suffering from flood risk plainly need to do that. That is your absolute moral, legal, and technical obligation. Next slide, please. The ingredients of success, you know all of this, you're a sophisticated audience. Involving communities is critical, having the right capacity is critical, developing the right policy with absolutely clear deliverables and targets behind it, not policy and local plans, which I read quite a lot, which is very provisional, but very definite. You have planning law to support what you're doing, and we need to develop the skills, which is partly why we're doing this training today. Next slide, please. Quickly on planning reform. If you, as I do, suffer from migraines, then you'll get one if you're trying to understand where we are with planning reform. Levelling Up Bill is at third reading report today and makes some fairly strong changes to the planning regime. None of it, I'm afraid to say, improves the situation for planning for flood risk in terms of the new legal duties that could have been introduced. The most significant thing that's happened in the last 3 weeks is essentially Michael Gove, the Secretary of State, changing very significantly the housing forecasting regime. In a letter dated 5th of December to all parliamentarians, he makes clear that he will make changes to make planning housing targets advisory in plan making and to downgrade the obligations around 5-year land supply plus 20%. It's extremely difficult for you on the ground. I mean, in local government, you have the hardest job in the world, trying to navigate what the centre is doing and the fact that it keeps changing its mind. And of course, in trying to actually build positive solutions with not very much. But my strong advice to you is, yeah, there's always chaos going on at the moment in planning reform, but crack on with plan making and good decision making. And bear in mind that these changes to housing forecasting do impact on what Sam will talk about and we will explore in terms of the sequential test, exception test, and wider sustainability benefits. Okay, next slide, please. So we're updating this resource, the climate guide. The TCPA RTPI guide is available for you. You can download it there. We're updating it at the moment, partly to reflect the guides you're going to hear about and partly to reflect some issues around net zero, which have come forward. Okay, so I'm now going to quickly hand over to Anne Chattignay from Floodry. Anne's been a great supporter of the TCPA's work on climate change. And I think most critically, Anne, you've been the person who's brought to the table the vital importance of insurance in this debate on how we plan for flood risk. Anne.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Yeah, so my name is Anne Chattignay. I'm Transition Policy and Impact Manager at Floodry. So Floodry exists to promote availability and affordability of home insurance for houses at high risk of flooding. Now, we exit the market in 2039. So that means that we need to have conversations with all our stakeholders, including local authorities, ahead of our exit to make sure that the necessary conditions for us to exit are in place. And that includes going beyond our reinsurance scheme and looking at what we can help to do to reduce flood risk or manage flood risk. Because from an insurer's perspective, risk needs to be managed or better understood. Now, we also know that even though we sit behind the insurer, so we don't have any direct contact with the consumers, we know that homeowners rely on planners to make the good decisions. And we had done a policy sprint with the TCPA, which the Environment Agency attended, whereby we had lenders and insurers confronting the views and common assumptions that we think everyone makes with regards to flood risk. So the reality is that current risk is provided for, but future risk is currently missing from those decision-making processes. Now, we don't know that NAFRA 2 is going to address this. And so this brings me back to the planning policy guidance update that came out in August that you're going to hear about from Sam. So the content is very, very welcome. And we're very pleased that that we're already seeing really useful mentions for adaptation, like talking about unsustainable locations and the need to have flexibility for meanwhile use or whole life development, or also multi-benefit SuDS, although on this point as well, surface water needs a statutory consultee, as you all know, and the implementation of Schedule 3 is still outstanding. And the third one, so I've mentioned climate change and the need to account for that in the flood maps. I've mentioned the statutory responsibility for surface water. That's also lacking, but I will also add the enforcement part. So the RTPI has also just released a very welcome research on the lack of enforcement resourcing, or the issue in enforcement resourcing, which is essentially a lack of resources and capacity in the planning sector. So we very much are aware of everything that local authorities face, but we see that the insurance industry can really help in partnering with the planning sector to address those issues linked to current and future flood risk. And I'll leave you with one statement that the National Infrastructure Commission report shared on surface water, and that was one of the recommendations, was that local authorities and water companies should work jointly together in partnership to address the issue of surface water. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because we'd like to echo this message, but of course it relies on local authorities joining the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And just to emphasize, I think for those not familiar with this, such a critical debate, lenders are not lending in high flood risk areas. Insurers are obviously, for houses built and after 2009, the flood reinsurance scheme is not available. So, as planners, sometimes we can get into the theoretical sense of planning balance and impacts. This is life-changing for people, isn't it? If you've allocated housing, every house built after 2009, the assumption is intrinsically safe for flood risk. And that assumption is not safe, as we all know. And that means the people living in those properties will not get insurance at reasonable cost as a result of a flood event, or at least they're not guaranteed to. So it is really critical territory. Without any more delay, I'm going to thank you, Anne. I'm going to hand over to Sam Kipling, who's Senior Advisor on Coast and Development Planning for the Environment Agency, who's going to take us, Sam, through what the updated guidance means for local decision making. Sam.
Thanks, Hugh. Hi, everyone. Firstly, big thanks to TCPA for hosting today's event and to Flood Re for supporting. And also a big thanks to you for taking time out of what's no doubt a very busy week before Christmas to come to this training session. So thank you for your time. Next slide, please. So flood risk poses a very significant challenge to our nation. We think about 5.2 million homes and businesses are currently at risk of flooding. But we also know that in the event of a major flood, for every one person that's directly affected, there tend to be around 16 other people who suffer the indirect knock-on effects of flooding. And this is because over 2/3 of properties in England are served by infrastructure that's at risk. And you can see some key statistics here of the extent of that. Our research shows that if existing development trends continue in line with projected population growth, we're likely over the next 50 years or so to see a doubling of the number of properties in the floodplain. Our research also shows that the development planning system plays an absolutely key role in ensuring that this doubling of properties does not result in a doubling of the flood damages and the misery that goes with flooding. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, this already considerable challenge isn't standing still. It's increasing significantly and ever faster because of the impacts of climate change. The IPCC's latest review of the science, it's clear that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land, and that we are going to miss our targets of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees likely to be exceeded this century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. The UN Secretary General has said that our window of opportunity to prevent the worst climate impacts is rapidly closing. Now, you might be forgiven for missing global events elsewhere in the world because of what's been going on here in the UK over the last 6 months or so. But we have this year seen the highest ever recorded levels of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane. They're the main greenhouse gases. More than 1/3 of Pakistan was flooded, with estimates suggesting around 30 million people were displaced from their homes. Over an 11-day period in the United States, back in August, they experienced 4 rainfall events that have a probability of 1 in 1,000 occurring each year. There were major floods in Australia, China, Spain, Iraq, India, Bangladesh, the list goes on. And meanwhile, over the summer, Europe has suffered its worst drought in over 500 years. Western America has suffered its worst drought in over 1,200 years. And the Yangtze River in China, which is relied upon for fresh water by over 400 million people, reached its lowest level since 1865. We've seen temperature records falling throughout the world and at home in the UK, and that's despite us currently being in a cooling event known as La Nina. The combination of high temperatures, floods and droughts have also affected global food supplies, making it far less resilient to shocks like the Ukraine conflict. I've added there the climate stripes specifically for the UK. So if you were in any doubt that this phenomenon is only affecting other places, this is the temperature change in the UK since 1884, and it can be interpreted intuitively. Okay, so the UK climate change risk assessment suggests that the evidence shows that we must do more to build climate change into any decisions that have long-term effects, like those decisions affecting new housing and infrastructure, so that we avoid the costly remedial actions that will be necessary in future. Next slide, please. So we expect warmer, wetter winters, resulting in more flooding. We expect hotter, drier summers, but with more intense rainfall, resulting in more flooding. And we expect sea levels to rise, resulting in more flooding in coastal areas. So what's the Environment Agency's role in managing flood risk? So we're responsible for managing flood risk from main rivers, the sea, estuaries and reservoirs. We build things like flood defences and other infrastructure to manage those risks. We also do things like warning and informing about flood risk from these sources. But as the diagram shows, there are lots of other bodies known as risk management authorities that are responsible for managing other sources of flooding. Most familiar ones will be lead local flood authorities that manage flood risk from surface water, groundwater and ordinary watercourses, and also water and sewage companies responsible for managing flood risk from sewers and some of the drainage network. The Environment Agency with the big circle around all the risk management authorities, we have a strategic overview role on all sources of flooding. And as part of this, we produce a national strategy which steers the work of this whole flood family. I've also added to the slide the statutory consultation arrangements that exist within planning for the Environment Agency and for lead local flood authorities, picking up some of those key sources of flood risk. But it's worth noting that there are significant sources of flood risk, including future flood risk from rivers and the sea, and also localised sources like surface water and groundwater flooding, for which there isn't a statutory consultee, where the Environment Agency or the lead local flood authority won't necessarily be available to provide expert advice. And so local planning authorities need to have a degree of expertise within them to pick up those risks without having to rely on consultation with those expert bodies. Next slide, please. So yeah, in our strategic overview role, we've published this national strategy in 2020, and it acknowledged that because of the scale and nature of the challenge we face, that we need to move the nation from a concept of protection to one of resilience. It's clear that traditional flood and sea defences will remain vitally important in lots of places, but it also acknowledges that we can't build our way out of future climate risks in many places. In different places, we'll need to call on a broader range of resilience tools. So the strategy sets out an ambition for England, which can be adapted to work in every place, recognising that every place is different and there can't be a one-size-fits-all solution. We also recognise that there are huge opportunities to deliver resilience in a way which allows communities to prosper and to grow, and which provides multiple benefits to people and to wildlife. We've, on the back of the strategy, now published a roadmap which sets out how the strategy will be implemented with the whole flood family over the next 5 years or so. Next slide, please. So this diagram attempts to summarise the resilience toolbox, if you like, a toolbox of measures that we might need to draw upon from in different places. And it clearly highlights the crucial role of spatial planning in tackling this resilience challenge. Next slide, please. So on to the case in point, the PPG update from August. So there were a number of triggers for why a PPG update was needed. There have been a number of iterations of the NPPF since the PPG was first published in 2014. It's also been something that has been looked at by a number of policy reviews and other reviews, which made recommendations for how policy and process could be improved to strengthen our response to flood risk and the climate challenge. Next slide, please. So on to some of the detail. So PPG supports the NPPF's key tenet of avoidance being the top priority, and we apply this through the use of the sequential test. The new guidance now provides greater clarity on when and how the test should be applied and by whom. There's much more emphasis on the role of the local planning authority in defining the search area, checking for alternative sites against the relevant evidence, producing a ranking methodology, and putting in place processes that allow the test to be produced, undertaken in a consistent, rigorous, and crucially an efficient way, which doesn't take up a huge amount of officer time. Next slide, please. So when does the test apply? So one of the key findings of the policy review that we undertook with DEFRA and DLUC last year was that many local authorities were failing to apply the sequential test to non-major developments, so developments of between one and nine dwellings. We think that's because many local authorities refer to development of that scale as minor development, and minor development is excluded from the sequential test. So the PPG clarifies the definitions for minor, major and non-major development, and is clear that when development is planned in flood risk areas, the sequential test must be undertaken for major and non-major development. Minor development is exempt, but please make sure that you're using the correct definition that's set out in the PPG and also in the Development Management Procedure Order. Change of use development continues to be exempt, and there are some helpful clarifications as well when planning applications come forwards on sites that have been allocated in a local plan. These are only exempt from the sequential test if they were subject to the test at local plan stage, if the proposed development is consistent with the use for which the site was allocated, and also crucially that there haven't been any significant changes in our understanding of flood risk since the site was allocated that would have changed the outcome of the test. Next slide, please. There's a tweak here, which is that the local authority, not the applicant, is now responsible for determining an appropriate area of search. Guidance encourages local authorities to set out what would be an appropriate search area for common development types to help improve the speed and efficiency of the process. Clearly, some developments have clear and obvious catchments like schools and fire stations, ambulance stations, those kind of things. But for others, often the starting point will be the local authority boundary. To shrink the search area down, we need to look to spatial policies that might justify a reduced search area, perhaps based on a settlement hierarchy or formal regeneration areas, for example. In some cases, it might be appropriate to look beyond the local authority boundary, especially if land outside flood risk areas is short to come by, and that might apply to significant infrastructure projects, for example. Next slide, please. The guidance now encourages local authorities to produce a methodology for ranking the relative flood risk between sites. And that's supported by our strategic flood risk assessment guidance that's called How to Prepare an SFRA, which lists out those factors which should be considered in coming up with the ranking methodology. And the ranking methodology is crucial because the sequential test has to be applied to all sources of current and future flood risk. The ranking methodology allows those different sources of flood risk to be compared so that when you're comparing two sites, perhaps that are subject to different types of flood risk or subject to different flood risk in the future, you have a clear methodology that you can turn to decide which is the preferable site for the purposes of the sequential test. There are also some good examples of ranking methodologies in the SFRA Good Practice Guidance, which is linked through from our gov.uk pages, which we co-produced with Adept. That should help you to come up with an appropriate methodology that works in your circumstances. Next slide, please. There's also emphasis on the local authority assembling the evidence that it has on land availability and using this to help apply the sequential test. Applicants only really need to check if other sites are available on the open market that the local authority aren't aware of, and perhaps to check the latest status of the sites that are identified to see whether or not they are in fact reasonably available. Local authorities are also encouraged to track whether sites remain reasonably available, and to, if there is a register of locally available sites, that they're ranked as well, so it's intuitive and quick to establish whether there are alternative lower risk sites that are available for the purposes of the sequential test. Next slide, please. Some of the key definitions, some of the key terms on the sequential test, like reasonably available, are now defined in the guidance. So sites in a suitable location for the type of development proposed, there needs to be a reasonable prospect that the site's available to be developed at the point in time envisaged. It could also be a series of smaller sites or part of a larger site. A key point is that alternative sites don't necessarily have to be owned by the applicant in order to be considered reasonably available. And the guidance helpfully clarifies that the lack of a 5-year land supply isn't a direct consideration for the sequential test for individual applications. So some useful clarifications and definitions in there now as well. Next slide, please. The PPG now provides some useful clarifications for circumstances when you undertake the sequential test and some lower risk, reasonably available sites have been identified. And so potentially the sequential test has not been satisfied. The guidance provides clarity now on when it's appropriate in those circumstances to move on to the exception test. And that's when planning applications submitted on those alternative sites that have been identified, when judged against local and national policies, would provide a clear reason for refusing those developments in those alternative locations. So there's now clarity about when it's appropriate to move on from the sequential test to the exception test, even when lower risk sites have been identified. So that's worth mentioning as well. And it's perhaps counterintuitively in the section titled Exception Test within the guidance. Next slide, please. There's also some useful definitions around the exception test. Some key terms like wider sustainability benefits to the community are defined. There are now some examples of what might constitute wider sustainability benefits to the community when you're undertaking that balance and weighing those up against flood risk. There's a new section as well on how to demonstrate whether a development has reduced flood risk overall. This is part of the second part of the exception test. And there are some tweaks to table 2, it was table 3, which shows flood zone incompatibility, not whether the development is appropriate. A subtle change, but the ticks before suggesting that development is appropriate didn't reflect accurately the fact that if a development fails the sequential test or the exception test, or fails to meet any of the other policy requirements of needing to be safe without increasing flood risk elsewhere, that development would still be inappropriate in those circumstances too. Next slide, please. So following the NPPF's lead, the PPG supports an integrated approach to flood risk management. What this means in practice is considering flood risk on a catchment-wide basis. So this could involve things like jointly preparing a strategic flood risk assessment on a catchment basis with your neighbouring authorities, so that the causes, impacts and solutions to flood risk management in the most efficient way can be found. It involves wider and early consultation with a range of risk management authorities early in the local plan preparation process, joining up with other strategic documents like water cycle studies and things like the drainage and wastewater management plans that water companies are producing now. And that's to identify holistic solutions which deal with too much and too little water in the most efficient way, whilst ideally delivering wider benefits and also unlocking development where too much or too little water is a constraint on development. Next slide, please. The NPPF is clear that development that increases flood risk elsewhere shouldn't be permitted, but there's now much more detail in the PPG on how to assess whether development will increase flood risk elsewhere. There's clear emphasis on the flood risk assessment to assess how a development might change flood risk elsewhere. And there's clear support for where development will result in the loss of floodplain storage, for making sure that development provides compensatory flood storage to make sure that no water is displaced. Guidance is clear that there's less need for emphasis on compensatory flood storage in areas which are defended to the appropriate standard, or where the risk comes from solely tidal areas where you're dealing with very large floodplains where the losses caused by development are likely to be insignificant. There's also some guidance on how to mitigate for the cumulative impacts of development through the use of green infrastructure, multifunctional SuDS, things like that. There's also a helpful clarification that the use of stilts and voids shouldn't normally be relied upon for compensatory storage. That's because of the problems that we have with stilts and voids in operating effectively during a flood and retaining their use over time. Next slide, please. Local plans are tasked with identifying and safeguarding any land that's likely to be needed for current and future flood risk management infrastructure like flood defences. There's a bit more detail in the guidance now about how to identify such land and how to safeguard it. It's clarity that you need to safeguard the land that's needed for access, perhaps any land that's needed solely during the construction period for future flood risk management infrastructure. And it also signposts some of the strategic flood risk documents that you can refer to in identifying the land that's likely to be needed. Once you've identified that land, there's some guidance then about how policies and allocations should avoid the development that could prevent or hinder the delivery of future flood risk management infrastructure. Next slide, please. So since 2012, we've had an NPPF policy which requires local plans to identify areas that might become unsustainable in the long term because of the impacts of climate change, and to seek opportunities to relocate any unsustainable existing development and infrastructure. So for the first time, the PPG now includes some definitions for what might constitute unsustainable locations. There's reference to coastal erosion, perhaps the most obvious one, but also to frequent flooding, particularly disruptive or hazardous flooding. Things like areas that are likely to be in functional floodplain in future, or areas where sea level rise would permanently or frequently inundate land by the sea. So there's some guidance on that now. That has to be, those risks have to be combined with there being little or no prospect of those risks being mitigated to an acceptable level through other activities. So things like future investment in flood or sea defences, for example, or retrofit of property flood resilience. There will be some locations where the risks cannot be mitigated to an acceptable level through those means. There's also guidance for how development should be controlled in such circumstances. And there's more detail on how planning can help to facilitate relocation. So, for example, in calculating housing need, if any existing homes need to be relocated from those unsustainable locations, that need would need to be reflected in those calculations as well, with appropriate provision made. Next slide, please. DEFRA is still completing its review of whether to implement Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, which would create a SuDS approval body and a new consenting regime for activity which has drainage implications. But the PPG took the opportunity in the meantime to make some helpful changes to the PPG to clarify how we should be implementing sustainable drainage systems on new development. So the definition of SuDS has changed. To be considered a sustainable drainage system, it must meet all 4 pillars of SuDS. So water quantity, water quality, biodiversity, and amenity. And that means that if a development comes forward where the NPPF requires the use of SuDS, so major developments and other developments in flood risk areas, it's incumbent on the applicant to provide clear evidence that the use of SuDS would be inappropriate. So it puts a burden of proof on the developer to show why they're not not including SuDS which meet those 4 pillars. There's now a much clearer requirement for planning applications to be supported upfront with a sustainable drainage system strategy, and that's to make sure that SuDS are thought about early in the planning system and not deferred to the back end of the process through planning condition, where we tend to get less good outcomes with grey SuDS that are pushed under the ground. There's lots of recognition for the wider benefits beyond the 4 pillars that SuDS can provide, like carbon sequestration. A crucial one is going to be urban cooling in the hot summers that lie ahead. There's also some encouragement for considering SuDS earlier in the design process, including in the context of local design codes. Next slide, please. Again, local plans have, for some time in the NPPF, been tasked with taking the opportunities presented by development to reduce the causes and impacts of flooding. And there's a whole new section now on how development might do this. So there's lots of information on natural flood management approaches, links to the green infrastructure delivery, the support for river restoration, so things like culvert removal, approaches that slow the flow, and also support for making space for river morphology, allowing natural meander migration, for example. And it also encourages a strategic approach to considering natural flood management approaches in local plans at a catchment scale, ideally. Next slide, please. Specifically on coastal change, there's now some more detail on the process of designating coastal change management areas. The guidance urges more precautionary now. So it suggests that coastal change management areas should be defined if the shoreline management policy is anything other than hold or advance the line throughout the whole SMP period of 100 years. It also impresses on the need for there to be evidence. So where the SMP policy is hold or advance the line, there needs to be good evidence that those policies, those management intentions are deliverable ones. There's a need, it empowers local authorities to identify erosion risk areas, even in cases where there are hold or advance the line management intentions in SMPs to mop up the residual risks that are associated with erosion in those locations. There's also now much greater flexibility for existing buildings and land use to change in the meantime within coastal change management areas. So in areas where we know that relocation is likely to be needed, and there's more flexibility to allow those communities to thrive in the meantime before relocation is necessary. There's also now a stronger emphasis on the need for planning applications to be supported by coastal change vulnerability assessments where development is planned in coastal change management areas. Recent changes, expansion of permitted development rights as well, has brought about the need for coastal authorities to consider whether any permitted development rights need to be removed through an Article 4 direction. So the planning guidance is clear that new permanent homes are inappropriate in coastal change management areas, and whilst there are prior approval for flood risk on many permitted development rights, there's no such prior approval for coastal erosion. So local authorities need to think clearly in coastal change management areas where the permitted development rights are going to result in unsustainable and inappropriate development. Next slide, please. There have been some tweaks to the definition of the functional floodplain. Its starting point for designation has changed to a slightly more precautionary 1 in 30 extent from the previous 1 in 20. Functional floodplain is really important, and they're areas that flood with the greatest frequency, and they tend to be areas where the risks are most severe as well. So preventing inappropriate development in these areas is crucial, and ensuring that development won't impact on how water can flow and be stored in those areas is also crucial. So it is a really welcome change, this. But we have had a few questions about how to manage this transition. So I'll spend a little bit of time setting out our advice on this. So it remains the case that functional floodplain needn't be based on rigid parameters. There's a degree of flexibility to account for local circumstances. Where local plans being prepared rely on allocations that are or could be affected by functional floodplain, more work is likely to be needed in SFRAs to provide confidence that those sites can be deliverable. Where windfall applications come forwards on or near existing functional floodplains, we're encouraging that you take a risk-based approach to requesting additional information from applicants through their flood risk assessments, depending on things like the scale, vulnerability of the development, and the sensitivity of the catchment in question, taking advice from the Environment Agency. So hopefully that helps with some of the transitional problems that might cause. Next slide, please. 1 or 2 other key details just to highlight. The design floods, so the main flood scenario that we consider the design of development against, now explicitly includes climate change and also surface water as a key source of flood risk. The revised PPG strengthens and clarifies the hierarchical approach we should be taking to considering the location and design of development. It confirms that avoidance should be at the top of the hierarchy, and confirms as well that the hierarchy should be applied even when the risks are only residual in nature. So even if you're behind a shiny new flood defence, you still need to apply the principles of the hierarchy to the location and design of development. It clarifies that methods that attempt to calculate the probability of flood defence failure are inappropriate and shouldn't be used in planning. Residual risk and the consequences of flood defence failure should absolutely be considered in planning, but the focus should be on the consequences of breach, and making sure that those risks can be safely managed should be the focus, rather than trying to argue about how likely or unlikely a breach might be to occur. And that's because of the significant uncertainties in trying to do that now, and especially in the longer term. There's also some guidance now on what we should consider the lifetime of non-residential development to be. It gives 75 years as a starting point. Guidance was previously silent on that, so that's a helpful clarification. Next slide, please. Finally, there's now some guidance for those preparing local development orders on how they should account for flood risk, and clarity that they should be subjected to the sequential test and to site-specific flood risk assessment to make sure that the development they're granting planning permission for is safe and sustainable. There's also some guidance that empowers the use of Article 4 directions. I've mentioned it for coast already, but the same process should be undertaken where permitted development rights are concerned within flood risk areas, particularly high-risk flood risk areas like functional floodplain. There's some greater clarity around the process that we should follow where local authorities are minded to grant planning permission contrary to Environment Agency advice, and clarity about when those cases need to be referred to the Planning Casework Unit on behalf of the Secretary of State, and the process that should be followed in trying to resolve those concerns, those objections, before we get to that stage of the process. And since its update in 2014, there's been a huge amount of work done by the agency and others to provide guidance and tools and advice to practitioners. And there are updated links to lots of different bits of guidance now to help practitioners implement these policies. So things like the Syria Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience, some joint guidance we produced with ADEPT on flood risk emergency plans, and also things like in relation to SuDS, the Water UK sewerage sector guidance, which, if followed, allows certain SuDS features to be adopted by the water and sewerage company. So hopefully that makes life easier for practitioners as well. So many thanks for listening. I'm going to hand back to Hugh now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam. We've got loads of questions to deal with, but just a couple of clarity points for everyone, for reassurance, really. Yes, this recording will be available and the slides can be circulated, Sam, I think, so people have got that background material. It is a really hard piece of territory to navigate, I think, but I'm going to just kick off, Sam, by with just a simple one, I suppose, that reflects, I think, the tenor of quite a lot of the questions we've had, which is essentially the weight, the overall weight of climate change and flood risk in the planning balance, which applies to all these key decisions. As far as I'm concerned as a professional, it's been significantly increased. That's both the lesson of the climate science and the impacts we're facing, but it's also kind of the lesson of this guidance. Is that a fair assessment? You're talking about approaching decisions with flood risk in the front of your mind.
Yeah, yes, I think so. Previous climate change risk assessments, national risk assessments have shown that flood risk and coastal change are top priorities that we face as a nation. And as I've said, our research shows the planning system plays a crucial role in doing this. I think government publishing this comprehensive update to planning guidance shows its commitment to the issue. And I think the clarity and detail that's included in there shows that it is an issue of great importance to be considered. My personal view is that preparing for the impacts of climate change that are already locked in, whilst making deep and rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, should be our personal and professional priorities.
Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to throw a few at you, Sam, and I'm going to set you the challenge of giving you no more than 6 words to answer each of them in, because there's a lot of questions more to get through. So the briefer, the better. There's a series of questions about surface water flooding and the availability of surface water flood risk maps. Can you just clarify if they're available or when they will be available?
Yes, the Environment Agency publishes a national map of surface water flood risk. It's based on a national model, but it also incorporates detailed modelling that have been undertaken by local authorities, as long as those models have been done in a particular way. So they're updated on a regular basis. We are, though, undertaking our second national flood risk assessment, NAFRA2 is known as, which by the end of 2024 will produce new and improved mapping and modelling for flood risk from rivers and the sea, but also for surface water flood risk. And for the first time, they will include allowances for climate change and the functionality to be able to adapt quickly when the climate change science gets updated. And they'll be made freely available, Hugh.
That's great, Sam. So that gives us a much more comprehensive resource. So what happens to the local authorities who've allocated sites in the local plan under the old system and now discover that, that none of those sites are sustainable for flood risk? How do they actually deal with that dilemma that they've allocated sites for housing, which now, as a result of these new updated forecasts, are really in unsustainable locations? Sorry, that's a very hard question to answer, but it's one that's been raised.
Yeah, sure. It's a difficult situation, and clearly, if there are big changes to policy guidance or our understanding of flood risk, then that might be a trigger for a local plan to be reviewed, and certainly for a strategic flood risk assessment to be reviewed. We, of course, have the safety net, if you like, of individual planning applications, which need to be supported by flood risk assessment that's based on the latest information, including the latest climate change allowances. And as I said, in the guidance where the sequential test is concerned, even if a site has been allocated, having passed the sequential test, if our understanding of flood risk has fundamentally changed since then, it suggests that the sequential test needs to be revisited. So there may be circumstances where an allocated site ceases to be appropriate and other options need to be considered. But I'd like to think that those circumstances are relatively rare.
Okay, and I'll come to you in a second if that's okay. But I just wanted to ask a couple more questions in relation to one in relation to cumulative impact. So there's quite a few questions which are related to the same issue about how local authorities deal with factoring in the cumulative impact of a number of developments across a sensitive catchment, and how that needs to be factored into decision making. Cumulative impact is a clear material consideration, Sam, in a wide range of issues in planning, isn't it? So I'm assuming that local authorities can consider the cumulative impact of a number of developments.
Yes, absolutely. I think NPPF and PPG make that pretty plain. In our How to Prepare a Strategic Flood Risk Assessment guidance, we offer some pointers on how SFRAs can consider changes across a catchment, things like urban creep or changes to land use patterns, to help understand how sensitive a catchment and the flood risk within it might be to those changes. Planning obviously can only control what it can control. So things like permitted development rights that don't have prior approvals are unfortunately beyond our reach at present. But that means that we should redouble our efforts on those things that we can control to make sure that they definitely don't make things worse, and that through development we take every opportunity presented to us to reduce the flood risk overall. And we can do that by supporting things like multifunctional SuDS, green infrastructure, and helping to support the delivery of natural flood management.
That's great, Sam. I'm going to push on quickly, but there's a couple more and then I'll come to Anne, which is one question is about the hell of a challenge for local plan makers in how fast guidance change and government changes its mind. What happens if you're at the late stage of making a local plan or even at the stage of trying to make a decision in relation to this guidance? The guidance was issued in August, so it's material to all decision making now, and I guess local planners just have to take that into account in local plan and decision making from now, hard though that is.
Absolutely, Hugh. Yeah, there were no formal transitional arrangements. Guidance was published on the 25th of August, and any decisions made thereafter will need to fully account for it, and I'd like to think will be given significant weight. This is just guidance, though. The policies haven't fundamentally changed. This is explaining how the NPPF's existing policies should be implemented. So I'd like to think the circumstances where fundamentally different planning decisions need to be made should be relatively rare, but acknowledging that things like changes to functional floodplain, could affect details and the principle of whether development's acceptable.
And it's worth bearing in mind from a very boring planning law perspective that the core planning legislation says that local authorities must take regard of policy and guidance issued by the Secretary of State, and doesn't distinguish the legal weight between the two things. So this guidance document is forceful. It has a real clear material weight in decision making. Another quick, because we're doing really well, Sam, I'm sorry to interrogate you like this, but could you just speak to a question which is at the relative balance between local flood authorities and the Environment Agency, so lead local flood authorities and the Environment Agency and their relationship. And the question was really about why the agency seemed to carry more weight or have more power in terms of reporting on the outcomes of decision making and flood events. What is the relationship between those two bodies, if you like?
Yeah, so the Environment Agency and LLFAs are statutory consultees. In the prescribed circumstances, local planning authorities must consult them for advice, and we are both bound by a duty to respond to provide advice. And I would expect our respective advice to be given considerable weight in the planning process. We have different responsibilities. I set out in one of my early slides those different sources of flood risk for which we're responsible, respectively. LLFAs focus their core advice on surface water management, so drainage and whether sustainable drainage systems have been incorporated. But many lead local flood authorities also choose to provide advice on those wider sources of flood risk that they're responsible for managing, so surface water flood risk, groundwater flood risk, and sometimes ordinary watercourse flood risk. Where there are complex interactions between those sources of flood risk, we try to work closely with LLFAs locally to try to make sure that local planning authorities receive clear, resolved advice between us. So yeah, I'd say it's a complicated picture, but I think we're working relatively well together. We're obviously working with government on wider planning reforms, and surface water flood risk is one of the areas where we think further improvements are likely to be needed. An obvious omission is the lack of a statutory consultee when development is planned in surface water flood risk areas, and that's a gap we think should be closed to make sure that very significant and increasingly significant issue is properly addressed in the planning system.
So we are running out of time, and I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the number of technical questions, which we will try and capture and we will try and respond to. But the last one before I move to Anne is a question that's raised, which bothers me as well. So people understand where floodplains are and the risks from that when applying the sequential test. But the question is, so how do we understand surface water and factor that in? You know, because we're talking about a different classification, aren't we? A different methodology for understanding surface water risk. So how do you balance those two issues out? Category 3A floodplain, easy to understand. Impact from surface water flooding, slightly less easy. So how do you balance those two things in a decision?
Yeah, so I think for a long time, surface water was wrongly characterized as being sort of quite benign. I think the repeated and really quite severe instances of surface water flood risk that we've seen in recent times, and that we're likely to see more of because rainfall intensity is going to increase quite substantially in some places. It's really important that we take it seriously. And we actually think that there are more properties at risk from surface water flood risk than there are at risk from flooding from rivers and the sea. I think we do have to put the right policies in place, and we do have a good quality national mapping product that allows practitioners to identify areas that are at risk from surface water. One of the key things will be when a planning application is submitted in those areas, making sure it has a flood risk assessment, because there's a clear requirement in the NPPF, footnote 55, that development in such circumstances needs a flood risk assessment. That means those risks need to be assessed and mitigated. And also, just to touch again on the ranking methodology for the sequential test, it's crucial that reflects surface water. But there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. The relative importance that you give from flood risk from rivers and the sea compared to surface water will vary wildly from place to place. So it needs to be considered locally. Thanks,
Sam. And I'm sorry, you've got about 30 seconds to ask a quick question if you have one.
No, it's more of a comment. I think the work we've done together with the Environment Agency and the TCPA is really trying to cut through the conversation to avoid the binary yes, no, we need to build or we can't build in that floodplain. So the floodplain remains where it is, but what we've been pushing for is trying to consider flood risk. So and the granularity within that. And so that means that you're moving from a mitigation point of view to an adaptation point of view. And there are real benefits there because the insurance industry can help. So for example, what we advocate for is property flood resilience measures. And Floodry has recently launched Build Back Better, which I'll put to link to in the chat, which essentially when someone is flooded, it gives the capacity to rebuild up to a cost, but rebuild resiliently. And those measures coupled with landscape-wide measures like SuDS can make a real difference, especially for surface water flooding.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Anne. Right. I'm going to bring this session to a close because we promised we would finish by 11 o'clock. I first of all want to thank Anne and Sally from the TCPA, and particularly Sam, who's been interrogated and roasted over this is and to leave you with this message really, this is life and death stuff. In balancing decisions around flood risk, you're holding people's livelihoods and lives in your hands as planners. And the ingredients of success are difficult, I think, because this is administratively a complex environment and policy is evolving. But for me, as a professional planner, you simply need to ensure that understanding of flood risk is front and center of your decisions, not peripheral or considered or a secondary issue or bolt-on, which is where it has been, but absolutely front and center. And in terms of dealing with the wider climate crisis, planning is so important. Often planners are denigrated, but it is so important that planning fully delivers on that wider climate crisis challenge. It's so powerful for mitigation and adaptation. And it's vital that people have local strategies. My strong advice to you, though, is, as I said at the beginning, government is, let's be honest, in a state of chaos. What's really important is that local authorities drive change on the ground. And a couple of final things. It's critical that planners have good relationships with elected members and that elected members support their planners. And it's vital that both parties are engaging with communities. Let's be honest, this is really hard to understand, a lot of this stuff. And we need to spend a lot more time trying to communicate it to people so that communities feel embedded in the process. It's vital for their mental health, actually, that people feel they can take action in the climate crisis. It's vital that they're part of that process. Please complete the survey if you get a chance, because it's really critical we understand your needs. It's really critical if you want to be rude about national policy or what we're doing about it. This is a space where you can do that and feed back to us and tell us what you think ought to change. We will do our best to capture all the questions. I'm sorry we can't deal with all of them live, but we will try and follow up on them best way we can with resources in the new year. And the recording will be available as well on the TCPA website. So finally, just to thank our speakers, to thank all of you for attending, and to wish you all the very best of luck with the climate crisis, and also a very Merry Christmas as well. Thanks very much, everyone.